Frank Miller had walked the same neighborhood streets for over 15 years, rain or shine. As the town's mailman, he wasn't just a familiar face. He was part of the daily rhythm of life. Neighbors trusted him, waved at him, and often shared their little stories as he handed over their letters. But among all the homes on his route, there was one that always stood out: the quaint, ivy-covered house at the end of Willow Lane, where Mrs. Eleanor lived. She was in her late 70s, frail but full of warmth, and she had made a habit of waiting for Frank on her porch each morning with a kind smile. Most days Mrs. Eleanor wore her neat cardigans and floral skirts, her silver hair tied back in a bun. She'd often hand Frank a cookie wrapped in a napkin, laughing that he was the only man she baked for anymore. To Frank, she wasn't just another stop on his route. She reminded him of his own grandmother, the kind of soul who made you believe the world still had goodness left in it. But this particular morning, as Frank turned the corner and approached her house, something felt different. There was no cheerful wave from the porch, no tray of cookies waiting on the little wicker table. Instead, the curtains were drawn tightly, making the house look dim and lifeless from the outside. A faint unease crept over Frank as he slowed his steps, clutching the stack of envelopes with Mrs. Eleanor's name neatly printed on them. When the front door finally creaked open, Eleanor didn't step outside. She stood just inside the doorway, her figure framed by shadows. Her face looked pale, almost sickly, and her eyes darted nervously behind him, as though she were checking to see if someone else was watching. She didn't offer her usual warm greeting, just a stiff, quiet nod. Frank hesitated, the silence between them stretching uncomfortably long. Trying to brush off his unease, Frank forced a smile. "Morning, Mrs. Eleanor," he said gently, holding out her letters. But as she reached forward with trembling hands, Frank noticed something he had never seen before in all the years he'd known her. Her clothes were disheveled, wrinkled as though she hadn't slept, and her cardigan hung loosely off one shoulder. For the first time he wondered if something might be terribly wrong inside that quiet little house on Willow Lane. As Mrs. Eleanor reached out to take the stack of envelopes, Frank's eyes instinctively dropped. That's when he noticed it: the strange, dark stains smeared along the legs of her light-colored pants. At first glance, it looked like she had simply spilled something, perhaps tea or coffee. But the longer he stared, the more unsettling it became. The stains weren't splattered, they were smeared, dragged across the fabric in uneven streaks, almost as if she had tried wiping them away but failed. The color was too deep, too dark, to be anything innocent. Frank shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. Rough morning?" he asked lightly, hoping she might laugh it off, maybe explain it away. But Eleanor didn't smile. Her lips quivered slightly as though she wanted to say something, then pressed shut. She tucked the letters quickly under her arm, moving her free hand to cover the stains as if she had suddenly realized he'd seen them. That gesture alone made Frank's chest tighten. He knew people, especially someone as tidy and meticulous as Eleanor, didn't try to hide coffee stains. The silence stretched, and the air between them grew heavy. Frank tried to meet her eyes, but she avoided his gaze, staring somewhere over his shoulder as if distracted. Or worse, frightened. The way her fingers trembled against the envelopes betrayed something she was desperately trying to conceal. For years, Frank had been the kind of man who minded his own business, but in that moment, he felt like every instinct in his body was screaming at him something's not right. Then, as the door creaked slightly wider, the faint smell of something metallic drifted out. A sharp, iron-like scent that twisted Frank's stomach. It was faint, almost unnoticeable, but he'd smelled it before during hunting trips in his younger days. Blood. His eyes flicked once more to the stains on her pants, and his earlier suspicion hardened into dread. He wanted to ask, to press her about it, but the fragile, fearful look on her face warned him not to push too hard. Eleanor finally whispered, "Everything's fine," her voice barely audible, before attempting to step back into the shadows of the house. But the way she said it, flat, rehearsed, hollow, didn't sound like reassurance. It sounded like a warning. Just as Mrs. Eleanor began to pull the door closed, Frank caught a fleeting glimpse into the dimly lit interior of the house. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, but the scene that flickered before him was unmistakable. The once cozy living room, where he'd often seen her knitting or sipping tea, looked as if a storm had passed through. A small table was overturned, one of its legs splintered. Glass from a picture frame lay scattered across the carpet, glinting faintly in the weak morning light. Frank's breath caught in his throat. He had been inside Eleanor's house, once or twice before, delivering a package she couldn't carry, and he remembered how immaculate it always was. She was the type of woman who polished her silverware weekly, and lined up her books with precision. To see her sanctuary in such chaos was jarring. It was more than just untidiness. It felt violent, as though something had happened there that she didn't want anyone to see. And then, just beyond the toppled furniture, Frank's eyes fixed on something that made his heart skip a beat, a reddish smear across the cream-colored wall, unmistakably shaped like a handprint. It was faint, partially wiped away, but still visible enough to freeze him in place. His pulse quickened, and the envelopes in his hand suddenly felt heavy, useless. Every instinct told him that he had stumbled into something dangerous. Something that should not be ignored. Eleanor must have noticed his stare, because she quickly shifted her body, blocking his line of sight. Her trembling hand tightened around the edge of the door, and for a moment, Frank thought she might slam it shut in his face. But she didn't. Instead, she stood frozen, her knuckles white, her eyes glassy and full of something he couldn't quite name. Fear, desperation, maybe both. The silence between them was deafening, broken only by the faint ticking of a clock somewhere inside. Frank forced a swallow, his voice coming out lower than he expected. "Mrs. Eleanor, is everything all right in there?" The question lingered heavily, but she didn't answer. She only shook her head slowly, almost imperceptibly, as though even speaking might bring danger closer. That tiny gesture sent chills down Frank's spine. Whatever was happening inside that house, it wasn't just unusual, it was terrifying. Frank stayed rooted to the spot, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Mrs. Eleanor's lips parted slightly, as though words were trying to claw their way out, but none came. Her frail shoulders quivered, her breath quick and uneven. For a split second, her eyes met his, and in that unspoken exchange, Frank felt something he couldn't ignore. She wanted him to understand. It wasn't what she was saying. It was what she wasn't saying. The way her gaze lingered told him she was desperate for help, but equally terrified of asking for it. Frank had seen people in distress before. Lost children, neighbors in small accidents, but this was different. There was a weight in her stare, a mixture of dread and urgency, as if every second counted. He noticed her hands again. Though she clutched the envelopes tightly, her knuckles were shaking, her nails dug into the paper so hard they almost tore through. It wasn't the grip of an old woman on her mail, it was the grip of someone holding on for dear life. Frank's mind raced. Should he step inside? Should he press her further? Or would that put her in greater danger? He glanced around the quiet street. Everything appeared perfectly normal. A dog barked in the distance, a sprinkler hissed on a nearby lawn. But that eerie contrast, the peaceful suburb outside versus the silent terror inside, made his stomach churn. He could almost feel the divide, like two worlds colliding right there at her doorstep. "Mrs. Eleanor," he whispered, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "If something's wrong, just tell me." He searched her face, looking for any signal, any clue. Her lips trembled again, and she leaned forward the slightest bit, her eyes glistening with tears that threatened to spill. Then, almost imperceptibly, she shook her head. Not in denial, but in warning. It was as though she was saying, "Don't ask here. Don't speak. Someone might be listening." Frank's skin prickled, a cold shiver running down his spine. He realized that she wasn't simply acting nervous, she was trapped, cornered by something, or someone, inside that house. Her silence wasn't a choice, it was survival. And in that chilling instant, Frank knew with absolute certainty that he had stumbled into something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. Frank walked back toward his mail truck with stiff, uneasy steps. The envelope still in his hand felt damp from the sweat on his palms. His chest rose and fell rapidly, as if he'd just run a mile. But it wasn't exertion. It was dread. He kept replaying what he'd just seen: the stains on her pants, the overturned furniture, that faint, unmistakable handprint. And most of all, the look in Mrs. Eleanor's eyes. That wasn't just fear. It was a silent cry for help. He climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. Should he just drive away? Pretend he saw nothing? That would be the easy thing to do. After all, he was just a mailman, not a police officer. But deep down, Frank knew if he left without doing anything, he'd never forgive himself. He had seen enough to know something terrible was happening behind that door. The question gnawed at him: was she in danger right now? Frank pulled out his phone, hesitating as his thumb hovered over the keypad. What if he was wrong? What if the stains were something harmless, the mess inside just an accident? Calling 911 could embarrass Mrs. Eleanor, maybe even get him into trouble for overreacting. The town was small, word traveled fast. People would whisper about how the mailman had called the cops on the sweet old widow at the end of the street. But then another thought slammed into him. What if I don't call, and she doesn't survive the day? His eyes flicked back toward the house. The curtains had shifted slightly, just enough for him to catch the faintest silhouette in the window. He couldn't make out who it was. It could have been Eleanor, or someone else entirely. The shadow lingered for a second before slipping out of view. Frank's heart skipped. If there was someone else inside that house, then Eleanor wasn't alone. And that meant danger was closer than he wanted to admit. Finally, with trembling fingers, Frank dialed 3 numbers 911. He pressed the phone to his ear, his throat dry as he struggled to find his voice. The operator's calm tone asked, "What's your emergency?" For a moment, Frank didn't answer, his mind racing with all the images of what he'd seen. He glanced once more at Eleanor's house, then whispered into the receiver, "I think something terrible is happening inside 42 Willow Lane." It didn't take long before the distant wail of sirens broke the stillness of the quiet suburban street. Frank sat frozen in his truck, heart pounding, as the sound grew louder and closer. Within minutes 2 patrol cars rounded the corner, their flashing lights cutting across the neat rows of houses. Curtains twitched as neighbors peeked outside, curious about the sudden commotion. To them, it probably seemed like just another disturbance. But Frank knew. This was something darker. The officers stepped out swiftly, their boots crunching on the pavement. One of them, a tall man with a stern jawline, approached Frank first. "You're the one who called?" he asked, his tone sharp but steady. Frank nodded quickly, his voice barely steady as he explained what he had seen: the stains, the overturned furniture, the strange silence, and Mrs. Eleanor's terrified demeanor. The officer's expression hardened with each detail, and without hesitation, he gestured toward the house. They approached the front door cautiously, hands resting near their holsters. Frank followed at a distance, his stomach twisting with guilt and fear. He wondered if he had just placed Mrs. Eleanor in even more danger. What if whoever was inside realized she had betrayed them by allowing the mailman to see too much? He wanted to call out to her, to reassure her, but his voice caught in his throat. When the officers knocked firmly on the door, the sound echoed through the still air. "Mrs. Eleanor. This is the police. We need you to open the door," one of them called. No answer. They knocked again, louder this time, but the house remained eerily silent. Frank's chest tightened. He could almost hear the faint tick of that clock inside, mocking the silence that followed. Every second of stillness felt heavier, stretching into eternity. Finally, one officer exchanged a look with his partner and nodded. With a swift motion, they forced the door open, the wood splintering as it swung inward. The moment the officers stepped inside, Frank caught a glimpse over their shoulders. Shadows stretching across the walls, the air heavy with a metallic tang, and the unsettling sense that something, or someone, was waiting in the dark beyond. The moment the officers disappeared inside, Frank's instincts screamed at him not to follow, but his curiosity was stronger. He lingered near the doorway, straining his ears for any sound. At first, there was only silence, punctuated by the crunch of broken glass beneath their boots. Then came the muffled voices of the officers, low and urgent, as they moved deeper into the house. Frank could only catch fragments. Overturned, bloodstains, basement. Words that made his skin crawl. One of the officers called out Eleanor's name, his voice echoing down the hall. No response. Another officer tried again, louder this time, but the silence that followed felt deliberate, as if someone, or something, was holding its breath. Frank stepped closer, just enough to peer inside. The living room looked even worse up close, the coffee table shattered. Curtains ripped, and a trail of scuff marks along the floor, as though something heavy had been dragged across it. Then, from the far end of the house, came the faint creak of a door. The officer's flashlight snapped in that direction, beams cutting through the gloom. It was the entrance to the basement. The wooden door stood ajar, revealing only darkness below. One officer placed a hand on his weapon, while the other slowly descended the first step, the flashlight beam trembling slightly, as it cut through the stale air rising from below. Frank held his breath, his body tense. He had no business being there, he was just a mailman, an observer. But he couldn't tear himself away. His eyes stayed fixed on the staircase, every nerve in his body screaming that whatever lay below was something no one should see. The officer's voice carried up from the darkness. "My God, there's someone down here." The words struck Frank like a blow, his heart hammering against his ribs. A second officer rushed to the basement door, and the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the wooden steps. Then came a pause, followed by a sharp intake of breath that Frank could hear even from where he stood. The silence that followed was unbearable, heavy and suffocating, before one officer shouted back up in a voice that was half command, half terror, "Call for backup." Numb. The sound of boots thudded against the basement floor, followed by urgent voices echoing up the narrow stairwell. Frank strained to listen, his pulse hammering in his ears. Then came the words that froze him where he stood. "She's alive. We've got someone down here." "Get the paramedics now." His heart lurched. Someone was alive. Inside Eleanor's house. Moments later the officers emerged from the basement, their flashlights cutting across the shadows. Between them, they guided a frail young woman, her wrists bound, her face pale and bruised. She stumbled, barely able to stand, her eyes wide with terror. Frank's breath caught in his throat. He recognized her. She was Eleanor's niece, the girl who had been reported missing nearly 2 weeks ago. The entire town had searched for her, and most had assumed the worst. Mrs. Eleanor appeared in the doorway then, her fragile frame trembling, her eyes brimming with tears. She reached out weakly toward her niece, but said nothing. Her silence told Frank everything. She had been living in fear, forced to keep quiet, protecting her niece the only way she knew how, by enduring whatever horror was inside that house. The stains on her pants suddenly made sense. She had tried desperately to free the girl the night before. The officers swept through the house, searching room after room, but whoever had done this was gone. The shadows swallowed the truth, leaving only broken furniture, bloodstains, and the suffocating sense that the real monster was still out there. Frank stood frozen by the porch, his mind reeling with questions he didn't dare ask. As the flashing lights painted the quiet street in red and blue, Frank realized something he would never forget. If he hadn't noticed those stains, if he hadn't trusted his instincts, the young woman in the basement might never have been found. Yet even as relief washed over him, one haunting thought lingered. If the kidnapper had escaped, how long before they came back?
If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.